Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Blackbirds, a London Blitz novel, by Melvyn Fickling, narrated by Nigel Patterson. Night shall be thrice night over you, and heaven an iron cope. Do you have joy without a cause, yea, faith without a hope? The Ballad of the White Horse, G.K. Chesterton, 1911. Part 1. Aurora. Chapter 1. Sunday, 6th of October, 1940. A teasing breeze cut through the wrought-iron gates, agitating the early autumn leaf fall around Bryan Hale's shoes. The funeral attendees drifted away in groups, and he maintained a respectful distance while they departed. Molly remained alone at the graveside. As Bryan approached, she looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you for coming. It's a long trip for you." Bryan put his arm around Molly's shoulders. "Andrew was my best friend," he said. "He was the best of men." Molly's chin dropped, and she crumpled against his chest, sobbing gently. Bryan clenched his jaw against his own emotion, holding her as much for his own comfort as her need for support. She took a deep breath, and the sobbing subsided. "Would you like to go for a walk? Maybe get some tea?" Bryan asked. Molly straightened herself, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "I have to go and feed my baby," she smiled through her tears. "I have responsibilities, you know." "Of course." Bryan took her hand and kissed it. "I'll always be there." Molly squeezed his arm and turned for the gate. She climbed into a car, and Andrew's father closed the passenger door after her. He glanced over at Bryan, loss and empathy in his gaze. Bryan nodded once and looked away. The car coughed into life and moved down the lane. Bryan bowed his head and surrendered to his own quiet tears. Someone nearby cleared their throat, awkward and self-conscious. Bryan raised his head, blinking the moisture from his eyes to focus on a man dressed in rough, mud-streaked clothes. A flat cap dangled from one hand, the other clasped a spade. The man glanced at the soil heaped on boards next to the oblong hole in the turf and raised an eyebrow. "Yes, sorry," Bryan muttered. He squared his shoulders to the grave and drew himself a touch straighter, but he did not salute. Andrew wasn't in the RAF anymore. Swivelling on his heel, Bryan strode back through the arch. The man jammed the cap onto his head and plunged his spade into the heavy, clodded earth. The rhythmic, boxy echo of soil striking oak receded as Bryan walked away from the cemetery gates along the road towards the railway hotel. People slowed their pace as they passed him on the pavement, offering wan smiles of condolence. None of them knew who he was, but in the small town of Wells-on-Sea they had all known about Andrew, and Bryan's RAF uniform broadcast the obvious connection on this funeral day. Face after face looked into his eyes, searching for something to take away, something to talk about, something that might place them closer to events they had no hope of understanding. Bryan's breathing constricted around the bubbling anger in his throat as he fought the urge to shout in their faces about the fear, the bullets, and the fire, how much he hated and loved it at the same time, how better men, indeed the better man now inside that wooden box, had gone to an early grave to save them their lazy, gossiping hours of freedom. He struggled to bite his tongue, and they mistook his anger for grief, gifting him the mantle of disguise he needed to make it back to the hotel porch. The clunk of the closing door brought the manageress into the hall. "Will you be dining with us tonight, Mr. Hale?" "No." The word rang harsh. He cleared his throat and continued in a softer tone. "I'm leaving today. I won't be staying another night." "Oh," the woman dithered, thrown by the change. "Would you like me to prepare your bill?" Bryan started up the stairs. "Yes, please." He fished the key from his pocket and pushed his way into the room. Scooping his shaving gear into a toilet bag, he glanced into the mirror and paused. A haggard edge pulled at his features. His tear-reddened eyes added an aged weariness beyond his 28 years. Behind it, he discerned a faint shadow of fear, the unspoken, uncertain count of days separating him from his own hole in the ground. Bryan slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and descended to the hall. The manageress stood waiting, twiddling with a hand-written bill. Bryan took the bill and scanned the scrawled writing. The total included the room charge for the second night. He glanced up, but the woman had busied herself straightening a picture on the wall. Bryan folded a 10-shilling note into the bill and handed it back. "Keep the change." Bryan pushed through the door back into the crisp, early autumn day. The brisk breeze was bedecked with the salt and seaweed smells of a North Sea fishing harbour. He wrinkled his nose against the onslaught, set his back to the water, and walked down the hill towards the railway station. Steam billowed above the station's slate roof. An engine had just arrived, and would be ready to leave the terminus within the hour. He'd make it back to London in time to catch a bus to Kenley. The train clonked and lolled as it slowed into its approach to Liverpool Street Station. The unlit urban landscape echoed the darkness in the carriage, the city's life made anonymous under its thick curtain of blackout, its packed acres of buildings skulking behind a delusion of safety, hoping that a simple absence of light might deflect the German night raiders. The carriage lurched over points, rousing Bryan from a fitful snooze. Squinting through the carriage window, he could make out the looming silhouettes of tenements lining the track. Here and there, a leaking glimmer of light outlined an ill-fitting curtain. His eyes were drawn up to the black dome of the night sky, and a spasm of anxiety crawled over his skin. A conductor sidled through the carriage. "No alerts yet tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Have a safe onward journey." He passed to the next carriage, and his litany drifted back. "No alerts in London yet tonight." The train jolted to a halt, and Bryan pulled his duffel bag from the overhead rack. He champed against the dryness in his mouth. He needed a drink. Shuffling off the train, he skirted around the throng of travellers and strode towards the station entrance. Once outside, he paused to make out his surroundings in the dark. Cars and buses trundled past, and people tripped and stumbled on their way. Across the road a door opened. A brief slant of light escaped with the hubbub of voices and the clink of a bottle against glass. Moving with exaggerated care across the road, Bryan headed for the now-closed pub door. On the far pavement, he bumped into an older man who cursed under his breath as he disappeared into the gloom. Bryan scrabbled for the handle and pushed through the heavy curtain inside the door. The immediate warmth in the smoke-filled room relieved the press of hovering menace suspended in the blank black skies outside. Bryan lit a cigarette. Drawing deeply on the smoke, he moved to the bar. "Pint of bitter, please." As he waited for his drink, he glanced about. A few uniforms dotted the room, mostly soldiers. Other men wore civilian clothes, standing at the bar in drinking groups or sitting apart at tables with their wives. Bryan's eyes came to rest on a table directly across the room. 4 people sat there. 2 sailors in uniform accompanied 2 young women. One woman chatted with some animation to the sailor at her shoulder, who leant forward, watching her lips as she talked and laughed. The other woman stared straight back at Bryan. "1 pint of bitter, sir." The barman set the dimpled mug down, and Bryan turned to pay him. He waited for the barman to retrieve his change from the till, thanked him again, and took a long draught of the ale. He could still feel the woman's eyes penetrating his back. Taking another long draw on his cigarette, he surveyed the room again, avoiding a direct glance at the group's table. From the corner of his eye, he caught the smile spreading across the woman's face as she continued to stare at him. He abandoned his ruse of nonchalance and returned her gaze. The woman sat with her legs crossed. Her skirt and blouse looked smart, but not flashy, and her shoes had moderate heels. Her long dark hair was pinned high, and a slight thrill fluttered in Bryan's stomach as he imagined it falling free. Her eyes shone deep chestnut, their shape emphasized with black liner. Her nose was straight and thin, and her lips celebrated in vibrant red lipstick. These features were infused with beguiling magic by the widening smile that beamed from her face. Bryan glanced at the woman's female companion, a blonde with a slightly blocky figure. She continued to talk and gesture, her sailor raptly entangled in her words. The other matelot glanced from one woman to the other, laughing half-heartedly at the blonde girl's stories, sipping nervously at his beer. Bryan's attention returned to the dark-haired woman. Her gaze remained unbowed for long moments, then she dropped her eyelids and came to a resolve. Standing, she walked across the bar towards Bryan, leaving her handbag and coat draped on her chair. The blonde stopped her flow of words and frowned. The nervous matelot's face dropped in confusion. Bryan maintained eye contact as the woman stopped before him. She chewed her lower lip for a moment and squinted into his face. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" she said.
"I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," Bryan answered.
"Jenny Freeman." She raised her chin to look him square in the face. "I was in your year at school, Bryan."
"Good Lord, yes." Bryan's shoulders relaxed. "The name does ring a bell."
"I was quite skinny and very shy," she smiled, "and you were rather tall and quite loud. Anyway, now you're here, I have a use for you."
"A use?"
"I need saving from the Navy," she grimaced, inclining her head towards the sailors. "My flatmate Alice got herself a date. He had a friend. I got talked into it, but,
"Oh, I see. Yes."
Bryan gulped down the rest of his beer and slung his duffel bag across his shoulder.
"I'll follow your lead."
Bryan walked with Jenny back to the table, picked up her coat and held it for her to put on. "I have to be away, everybody." She held up a hand. "This is Bryan, an old friend. He's offered to walk me to the tube station."
"Gentlemen?"
Bryan nodded to each sailor in turn.
"Miss?"
He raised his cap to Alice. Placing his hand on the small of Jenny's back, he guided her between the tables to the door. Once outside, they lurched to a halt, their sight momentarily disabled by the dazzle of the bright lights they'd just left. Jenny tutted. "I will never get used to groping about in the dark." She gripped Bryan's arm. "Can you see anything yet?" People-sized shapes loomed around them as their eyes adjusted.
"It's starting to come together."
Bryan placed his hand over hers.
"Where are we heading?"
"Northern Line. Bank Station is probably the easiest. This way." They set off along the pavement. "Thank you for getting me out of that. It really wasn't any fun at all."
"Your friend, Alice, will she be all right?"
"Oh, I wouldn't worry about Alice." She smiled up at Bryan. "So, you're wearing RAF uniform. Which branch are you in?"
"Fighter Command," Bryan said. "Bluebird Squadron, Spitfires."
"You're a fighter pilot?"
"Yes."
"Crikey, what's it like?"
"Very fast and not a little dangerous."
Jenny laughed. "Sounds a bit like Alice."
Bryan joined her laughter. "And what do you do?"
"Ministry work. Archiving and records mostly. Can't say too much about it. They made me sign a bit of paper." They came to a crossroads, and Jenny squinted into the darkness. "Straight across here." They hurried across the road and stepped up onto the curb. "So, what brings you to London with your duffel bag?"
"I'm on the way back to my squadron at Kenley."
"Have you been on leave?" Jenny asked. "Visiting your girlfriend?"
"I was attending a funeral," Bryan said. "A friend from the squadron."
Jenny stopped and looked into his face. "I'm sorry, Bryan. I didn't mean to be so clumsy."
"Think nothing of it," Bryan said. And I don't have one.
Excuse me?
A girlfriend. Bryan started walking again. I don't have a girlfriend.
They continued together for a short distance before Bryan broke the awkward silence.
Which means I can buy you a drink sometime, if you'd like.
Jenny said nothing for a few steps, her eyes fixed on the ground. Then she nodded. I think that might be nice. The pavement became more crowded, and many of those that thronged about them carried suitcases and rolled blankets. Caught up in this implacable human flow, they swept around a corner to the sandbagged tube station. A dull glow emanated from its depths. Jenny pulled Bryan to one side. Here. She took a small notebook from her handbag and wrote down a number. She tore off the page and pressed it into his hand. This is my home number. I do a fair bit of overtime these days, so you'll have to trust to luck to find me there. Thanks again. She stood on tiptoes, planting a kiss on his cheek. As she turned to leave, a low wailing penetrated the middle distance, rising to peak at a flat, mournful moan. The shelterers quickened their rush for the stairs, and Bryan gazed upwards as searchlights pricked and probed at the clouds. A policeman stood nearby, ushering the crowd off the pavement. Bryan tapped his shoulder.
What's the best way to get to Victoria?
Down the steps, sir. Look for the Circle Line eastbound. Bryan smiled his thanks and started down the steps. Some way ahead, he spotted Jenny amongst the crowd streaming through the open barriers, his eyes drawn to the sway in her walk. In a moment she vanished, swallowed into the throng flowing down the tunnel towards the Northern Line. Bryan slowed to read the signs overhead, jostled by the river of people moving around him. He found the eastbound tunnel and squeezed down the steps to the platform. He picked his way through the groups of shelterers, each marking their territory for the night with blankets. Bryan found a clear spot midway down the platform and lit a cigarette. Minutes later, the next train arrived, and he stepped onto the near-empty carriage. Already flushed from exertion and his chance meeting with Jenny, the stuffy warmth in the tube carriage pricked sweat onto his eyebrows. He removed his overcoat, folded it carefully, and sat down, tucking his duffel bag between his calves. A man opposite studied Bryan's uniform with a mixture of interest and disdain.
You a pilot?
A slur dulled the man's voice.
Bryan nodded. Yes. So why don't you get up there and fight the bastards?
Murmurs of approval drifted down the carriage from a group of women. An elderly man made no noise, but peered over his glasses at Bryan, waiting for his answer. Bryan looked around the group and back to his questioner.
That's what I have been doing, almost every bloody day.
The man barked a laugh.
What good is that if they're coming back every bloody night?
The tunnel's darkness flashed to the bright lights of the next station, Aldgate. The man's eyes remained steady and hostile. Bryan stood up and stepped from the carriage. Better to wait a few minutes for the next train than to continue in an argument he had no interest in winning. Prostrate Londoners filled most of the space around him, bedding down on the smooth, hard platform, trading comfort for safety. Bryan kept his back to the carriage while the train drew away. Directly in front of him, a small girl in grimy clothes slept with only a thin woolen blanket between her and the warmth-sapping concrete. 3 inches from her face, a large gob of snot and spittle glistened in the lights. Swallowing hard, Bryan fixed his attention on the white tiles that covered the curved tunnel wall, and waited until a train whined in behind him. He boarded, avoiding eye contact as he sat down. The tube train whisked him away through the tunnel, alternating darkness and harsh illumination. The lights at each station revealed a different human tableau. People hunkered on the indurated platforms, grasping to them the things they treasured the most. Mothers clasped their children, the children clasped their dolls. Above ground, their homes, temporarily abandoned for the sake of subterranean safety, stood at ransom to the random interplay of gravity and high explosives, of switches thrown and buttons pressed thousands of feet above them in the cold, dark sky. Victoria Station rolled around. Bryan bundled off the train and up the stairs. The chill night air dried the sweat on his face. Shivering, he pulled on his overcoat, while booming explosions reverberated from the station walls in a demonic rhythm set by a nearby anti-aircraft emplacement. In the distance, the soft crump of bomb blasts drifted on the air. Bryan hefted his duffel bag and walked out to the line of buses. A ticket collector strolled past.
"Excuse me." Bryan caught him by the arm. "I need to get to Kenley Airfield."
The man pointed at a double-decker parked in the row.
"That one there."
He smiled at Bryan.
"You're a lucky man. It looks like you've caught the last bus."
Chapter 2. Monday, 7th of October, 1940.
"Flight Lieutenant Hale?"
The man shook Bryan's shoulder.
"It's 6 o'clock, sir. Time to get up."
Bryan parted his dry lips with a drier tongue.
"I pray that God may one day bless you, Hopkins."
He rolled over and reached for the mug of tea steaming on his bedside table.
"What's the weather like?"
"Good enough to expect a visit, I'm afraid, sir." Hopkins pulled Bryan's uniform from the wardrobe and brushed the lint and stray hairs from the jacket. "Bluebird are on readiness from 11 o'clock. Your bath's ready." Bryan bathed and dressed in silence. In front of the mirror he combed his hair. He noted new lines scoring his forehead, and his eye sockets harboured shadows. Maybe he needed more sleep. Bryan walked to the mess, nodding acknowledgement to saluting airmen along the way. Sitting alone, he quickly dispatched a breakfast of fried eggs and toast with another mug of hot sweet tea. He signed the mess chit and stepped outside, sniffing the air with predatory interest. The milky autumnal sun struggled to get above the treetops, but he could already tell that Hopkins was right. The Germans would be over today. He took a detour out onto the field past the dispersal pens. It was the longer route to his office, but he felt mildly disconnected, still unsettled by the previous day's events, and drawn by his viscera to be close to the aircraft. Bryan quickened his pace against the morning's chill and headed out towards his own Spitfire. The pungent ghost of aviation fuel laced the air, and on the other side of the field a ground crew fired up a Spitfire for engine tests, the rough cough of the starter battery giving way to the full roar of its Merlin engine. The sound helped Bryan settle back into his own skin. He arrived at his plane to find his rigger working on the guns, checking and greasing the mechanisms from beneath the wing.
"Morning, Mortis."
Bryan stooped to peer under the wing.
"Is she ready?" "She won't be long," the rigger smiled. "Just making sure everything's in order. You see, someone else took her up yesterday, sir, while you were away at the—" The rigger looked down, a frown crumpling his brow. "The funeral?" Bryan finished the sentence. "It all went well, Mortis. Andrew had a wonderful send-off." "I'm glad, sir." The rigger's face brightened. "Mr. Francis was a good 'un." Mortis went back to his work, and Bryan sauntered away, lighting a cigarette. Thoughts of Andrew, sirens, and Jenny tumbled around his head. He took a hard pull on his cigarette and fished in his trouser pocket. His fingertips found the slip of paper. He unfolded it and gazed at the number for long moments. Bryan sat at his desk, watching the smoke curling up from the cigarette balanced on the ashtray's edge. The door rattled to someone's knock. "Come in," Bryan said, without raising his head. The door opened to admit Harold Stiles, Bluebird Squadron's adjutant. He carried an armful of paper files. Bryan looked up as the other man sat down. "Ah, Madge," he drawled, "you've brought paperwork. How nice." He wrinkled his brow. "I'll be flying in an hour or so. Can't it wait? I'll do it if I come back, I promise." Stiles ignored the banter. "Good morning, Bryan." He laid the files on his desk. "I trust all went smoothly?" "Yes, it did, until I got back to London."
Bryan grimaced across the desk. Some people think we're not working hard enough. Which people? People on a bloody tube train, Harry. Bryan picked up his cigarette and stubbed it out with some force. I believe they're called the general public. They suggested I should be flying about in the bloody dark, shooting down the bombers. Well, the adjutant leant forward, that's not possible in Spitz. The exhaust flames mess up your night vision. But... He paused. But what, Madge? There's some hush-hush developments concerning a specialized night fighter force, on board RDF, that sort of thing. So? So, they're asking for top-notch pilots to volunteer. Bryan's eyes narrowed as he regarded the older man. This RDF, it's going on board what exactly? Mostly Blenheims. Mostly? They're planning to use Hampdens in the western sectors. The adjutant chewed his lip as the silence settled like foreboding. Bryan lit another cigarette. I am not, he stabbed a finger at the other man, repeat not, going back to flying those decrepit old crates. He pushed his chair away from the desk and stalked to the window. I have a Spitfire, and that's what I intend on keeping. Your boffins can get their cab drivers from somewhere else. The adjutant sighed. I just thought I'd mention it. He flipped open the file of papers. We do have some serious paperwork to get through. Bryan ambled back to his desk. Why? What's the flap? Styles cleared his throat. I'm afraid they're taking Bluebird out of the front line. What? Bryan exploded. Why? Where to? They're rotating us to a quieter section. It's intended to give the lads a rest. A rest? Bryan slumped into his chair. The ones that did all the bloody hard work are dead. Bryan's eyes bulged with outrage. They're getting plenty of rest. I'm sorry, but it's come straight down from the top. There's nothing I can do. We move out in 2 weeks' time. Bryan dropped his head into his hands. Where to? Scotland. Jenny stuck out her jaw at the mirror as she applied her lipstick. It was getting low, and makeup had already become scarce in the shops. Hopefully all the women in London would run out on the same morning, and they'd all be forced to go to work that day au naturel. She smiled at the idea as she combed her fringe into place. She paused at the sound of a key in the flat door, and her smile broadened. "Good morning, Alice," she called. "Will you be joining us at work today?" Alice's disembodied voice carried down the hallway. "Yes, but I need a bit of a swill first. Will you wait for me?" The gush from the bath taps clattered onto the enamelled tub. Jenny walked down the hall and leant on the doorframe, watching her friend undress. "And if that porter looks at me funny one more time, I shall swing for him." Alice squirmed in her underwear. "Unhook me, Jen, there's a love." Jenny leant forward to spring the brassiere. "Will you be seeing your sailor again?" "No, they sail at lunchtime today." "They?" Jenny sat down on the toilet seat as Alice climbed into the steaming bathwater. "You didn't." "You and the porter can think what you like. I'm saying nothing." Alice splashed some water onto her face and lathered the soap. "Who was that you left with? Some sort of Brill cream boy?" Jenny nodded. "He's a Spitfire pilot." Alice's jaw dropped and she blinked through the soap bubbles. "No," she cooed. "You lucky cat." "I knew him from school. It was pure chance he came into the pub. He'd just come back from leave." "And you're seeing him again, aren't you?" Alice's eyes bored across at Jenny. "You know what I think about wartime relationships. How can anything last if it's built on shifting sands?" Alice cocked her head. "You are seeing him again." Jenny smiled. "I gave him our telephone number." "Ha ha!" Alice splashed the water with her hands. "The Ice Queen thaws at last." Jenny stood and straightened her skirt.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?